Welcome back to Audiobook Alchemy. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance by Angela Duckworth. If you're looking for a way to get the key takeaways from awesome books like this one, just hit that subscribe button.
Yeah.
So this book really caught my eye because Duckworth's own story is intertwined with her research. She wins a MacArthur Fellowship, which is like the genius grant. But she spent her whole life being told she wasn't a genius.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? It makes you think, what was it about her that allowed her to do all these amazing things if it wasn't just raw intelligence? That's exactly what she's trying to figure out in Grit.
Okay, so let's break this down. One of Duckworth's most interesting studies was at West Point Military Academy. You wouldn't think someone focused on grit would end up at West Point, but it actually makes total sense.
It does. She looked at cadets during Beast Barracks. It's the super intense summer training program that's meant to push them to their absolute limits. It's designed to weed out the cadets who aren't really cut out for military life.
So you'd think the cadets with the best grades and physical fitness scores would be the ones who would do the best, right?
You'd think that, yeah. But her research showed something different. The biggest predictor of who actually made it through Beast wasn't those typical aptitude measures. It was grit. This mix of passion and perseverance that she's dedicated her career to understanding.
That's wild. Duckworth even uses examples from history to kind of challenge this focus on talent, right?
Yeah, she does. She talks about Francis Galton, this scientist from the 1800s who studied people who were really successful. At first, he thought talent was everything, but eventually he decided that passion and hard work were just as important. We tend to put too much emphasis on natural talent. Duckworth calls this naturalness bias. We just assume that successful people are naturally gifted, and we forget about all the effort they put in to get there.
Yeah, I see that. It's easier to think someone is just naturally brilliant than to think about all the hard work they must have done. This reminds me of Duckworth's own experience as a teacher. She noticed that even among her most talented students, raw talent didn't always equal success.
Right. She talks about two of her students, David, who wasn't considered ready for advanced math but ended up becoming a rocket scientist, and Chia, who was a talented musician but reached a whole new level through consistent practice. It really shows that talent might give you a head start, but what you do with it determines how far you'll go.
So true. Her concept of effort counts twice really drives that point home.
It does. It's not just that effort helps you build skills, but it's also that it allows you to use those skills effectively, which leads to greater achievement. Think about Warren Buffett's intense focus or Woody Allen's principle of just showing up consistently. They didn't achieve that level of success just because they were talented. They put in the work day after day, year after year.
And who could forget Will Smith's quote about talent and skill? Talent you have naturally. Skills only developed by hours and hours and hours of beating on your craft. This brings up an interesting question for you. When you think back to a time you achieved something you were really proud of, was it raw talent that got you there? Or did hard work play a bigger role?
That's a good question for everyone listening to think about. It's easy to get caught up in what we're naturally good at. But this book really pushes us to think about what we're willing to work hard for.
Totally. And it's not just about showing up either, right? Duckworth created the grit scale to measure not only perseverance, but also passion. But she's not talking about that fleeting excitement.
Exactly. It's about having a consistent and enduring devotion to something. She uses the example of Jeff Gettleman, this Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for covering conflict in East Africa for decades. He didn't just happen to stumble onto a big story and win an award. It was years of focused and passionate work that led him to that success.
That's powerful. So what can we learn from that? Think about the things you've been interested in for a long time. How do they line up with your goals? It's something to consider as we keep going on our deep dive into grit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Duckworth argues that passion often needs to be nurtured and developed. It doesn't always just hit you like a bolt of lightning.
That makes me think about people who discover a new passion later in life. Is it ever too late to develop that passion and pursue something you love?
I think Duckworth would say no. She uses the example of Mark Vetri, a world-famous chef who developed his passion through years of hands-on experience and supportive relationships in the kitchen. It wasn't about being some kind of natural culinary genius. It was about immersing himself in the world of food, finding mentors, and just getting more involved. He found his passion through working and learning.
That's inspiring. So how can we put this into practice? We've talked about effort and passion, but where does deliberate practice fit into all of this? Duckworth talks a lot about the importance of focused and challenging skill development for achieving mastery.
Deliberate practice is essential. Yeah. But we should be careful not to confuse it with flow. Flow is that state of effortless absorption we feel when we're fully engaged in something. Flow usually happens when our skills match the challenge in front of us, while deliberate practice pushes us beyond our comfort zone, which is where real growth happens.
I see. So flow is like playing a song you already know on the piano, and deliberate practice is like learning a difficult new piece. So are you saying that even though deliberate practice may not always be enjoyable, it's crucial for deeper learning?
That's exactly it. What's interesting is that Duckworth actually found that people with more grit tend to enjoy deliberate practice more.
Oh, really? So they actually like push themselves.
It seems that way. Maybe they've learned to appreciate the rewards of hard work. Or maybe they just enjoy overcoming challenges.
So maybe grit is kind of like developing a taste for certain foods. At first, you might not like the bitterness of coffee or the spiciness of chili peppers, but over time, you start to appreciate those complex flavors. In the same way, the challenge of deliberate practice might become more enjoyable as we develop our grit.
I like that analogy a lot. It kind of reframes grit as something we can learn to enjoy rather than something we have to force ourselves to do.
I love that. So this brings us to another important element of grit, purpose. Duckworth argues that having a sense of purpose, that feeling that our work matters to something bigger than ourselves, can fuel our passion. And it can help us keep going, even when we face setbacks.
Right. She shares this really inspiring story about Alex Scott, this young girl who was diagnosed with neuroblastoma. Even while she was fighting cancer, she was determined to make a difference.
She started setting up lemonade stands to raise money for cancer research.
Exactly. Sadly, she passed away at the age of 8, but by then she'd already raised millions of dollars and inspired tons of people.
Wow. That's an incredible example of how purpose can fuel grit.
It really emphasizes the idea that aligning our work with something meaningful, something that contributes to the well-being of others, can give us so much motivation and perseverance.
It makes you think about the potential impact of your own work, right? What kind of contribution do you hope to make through your efforts? It's something we should all think about.
It is. And that leads us to the last element of grit we'll talk about in this section, hope.
Hope. That unshakable belief in our ability to get over obstacles and achieve our goals. It's essential for grit, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's what keeps us going when we face setbacks and when we doubt ourselves. Duckworth distinguishes between optimism and pessimism. She says that an optimistic outlook, that belief that we can find solutions even when things are tough, can actually lead to more success. It's not about ignoring challenges. It's about approaching them with the belief that we can overcome them.
It's about having a can-do attitude even when things get rough.
That's it. She tells the story of Tom, a soldier who was shot in the leg and told he might never walk on his own again, but he refused to give up.
He pushed himself beyond his limits in physical therapy, and not only did he regain his ability to walk, he even started running marathons.
Exactly. His story is a testament to the power of hope and self-belief. He could have easily just given up, but he chose to believe that he could recover. And that belief, that hope, fueled his incredible grit.
These stories of people who achieved amazing things through grit are so inspiring. But I also keep thinking about the role of our environment. Do you think our culture and the people around us can influence our grit?
That's definitely a question Duckworth explores in the later chapters of the book. She looks at how external factors like the culture of an organization can either support or hinder grit. She uses 2 very different examples to show this: West Point Military Academy and the Seattle Seahawks.
2 totally different worlds,
Yeah.
but both known for cultivating grit in their members.
Yeah, at West Point, it's all about tradition, discipline, and a shared commitment to serving something larger than yourself. The cadets are constantly challenged to push their limits and persevere through tough times. It's just a part of their culture.
And the Seattle Seahawks, under Coach Pete Carroll, have a different kind of approach.
They emphasize a positive, growth-oriented mindset, encouraging players to embrace challenges and always try to improve. They have this saying, always compete.
And no whining, no complaining, no excuses.
Right. It's about building a culture where people feel comfortable taking risks, learning from their mistakes, and pushing themselves beyond what they think they're capable of.
It's so interesting to see how these organizations, even though they're so different, have found ways to encourage grit in their own unique ways. It makes you think about how our own environment affects our grit.
It does, and it makes you wonder how we can create a culture of perseverance and growth in our own lives and communities. What can we do to create that supportive and challenging atmosphere for ourselves and the people around us?
That's something we'll be exploring more as we continue our deep dive into grit. So we've seen how grit can show up in individuals and even whole organizations. But I'm curious, does Duckworth talk about any potential downsides to being super gritty? Could there be a point where it's actually harmful?
That's a really good question. And it is something she addresses in the book. Some people might worry that, like, constantly chasing goals could make you unhappy or even lead to burnout. But her research actually showed that people who are grittier tend to be happier.
Wait, so you're saying being gritty doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your well-being?
That's what it seems like. It kind of makes sense when you think about it. Having a sense of purpose and working hard towards something you care about can be really fulfilling.
Yeah, I can see that. But what about the talent piece? We've talked a lot about effort. But does Duckworth completely dismiss natural talent?
No, she doesn't dismiss it completely, but she does challenge the way we usually think about it. We tend to focus on that, like, inherent ability someone seems to have effortlessly, those natural talents. But she argues that skill development is just as important, if not more so. It's not just about what you're born with, it's about what you do with it.
So someone with a little bit of talent but a ton of grit could actually do better than someone who's naturally gifted but doesn't put in the work.
That's exactly what Duckworth's research suggests. She talks about developing a growth mindset, this belief that our abilities aren't fixed and that they can be cultivated through effort and learning. It's about seeing challenges as opportunities to grow instead of proof of our limitations. And that's where deliberate practice comes in again.
Right. That focused and intentional practice that pushes us past our comfort zone.
We talked about how it's not always fun, but it's necessary for mastery. But how do we actually motivate ourselves to do it, especially when it feels hard?
That's where finding purpose and meaning in our work is so important. Duckworth argues that connecting our efforts to something bigger than ourselves can fuel our passion and help us keep going even when we run into those setbacks.
So it's not just about pushing ourselves just because. It's about having that deeper connection to something that matters. It makes me think about all those gritty people we've been talking about. They're not just working hard for themselves. They're driven by a desire to make a difference. Yeah, it's a really powerful motivator. In fact, Duckworth found that a sense of purpose can even help us overcome fear and anxiety.
Really, fear and anxiety can be like huge roadblocks when it comes to reaching our goals. How does purpose help with that?
It gives us perspective. When we connect our efforts to a cause we really believe in, our own personal struggles can seem smaller.
So it's like our own problems shrink when we compare them to this bigger mission we're working towards.
Exactly. Our fears and anxieties don't just disappear, but they become easier to handle when we have a sense of purpose to ground us.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of what Duckworth said about hope, that belief in our ability to overcome obstacles and achieve our goals. We talked about how it's a crucial part of grit, but I'd love to hear more about her distinction between optimism and pessimism.
She says that having an optimistic outlook, that belief that we can find solutions even when things are tough, can actually lead to more success.
So it's not about blindly believing that everything will work out perfectly. It's about having that faith in our ability to find a way forward even when things are challenging.
Exactly. She uses the story of Tom the soldier who was shot in the leg to illustrate this. Remember how he was told he might never walk on his own again, but he refused to give up hope?
Yeah. And he ended up not only walking, but running marathons.
His story is such a powerful reminder of the connection between hope, self-belief, and grit. He could have easily given in to despair, but he chose to believe in his ability to recover. And that belief, that hope, is what fueled his incredible effort.
It's amazing what we can accomplish when we have hope. These stories of people overcoming challenges through grit are so inspiring. But I keep coming back to this idea that our environment plays a role too. Can you talk more about how Duckworth suggests we create a culture of grit in our own lives and communities?
She says we should start by just being more aware, be more mindful of the messages we're sending both to ourselves and others. It's about changing our language. Instead of just praise and talent, we should focus more on praise and effort and learning.
So instead of saying, "You're so smart," we could say, "I'm really impressed by how hard you worked on that." It's about focusing on the process instead of just the outcome.
Exactly. It's about encouraging a growth mindset, even in small interactions. And it's about modeling that growth mindset ourselves. It's not just about what we say, but what we do. Duckworth talks about the importance of being lifelong learners, always looking for new challenges and embracing opportunities for growth.
I like that. It means that even as adults, we can keep working on our own grit.
Definitely. And as we do that, we inspire the people around us to do the same.
It's a cool thought. By embracing grit ourselves, we can actually help create a world that's more grit-friendly.
Yeah, in a world that's so focused on instant gratification and effortless achievement, cultivating grit becomes even more important. It's about developing that deep passion and perseverance that allows us to stay focused on our goals even when things get tough.
And to keep going, even when we have doubts and face setbacks. Because, like Duckworth says, it's in those moments of struggle that true grit shines through.
And it's where we have the best opportunities to grow and find fulfillment. But even with all this talk about how important grit is, Duckworth doesn't ignore the fact that there might be a downside to having too much of it.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Is there such a thing as being too gritty?
That's the question of balance. Duckworth brings up the point that sometimes knowing when to quit is just as important as knowing when to keep going.
So it's not about stubbornly sticking to something no matter what. It's about being smart and strategic.
Right. It's about recognizing when our energy and effort might be better spent somewhere else, when letting go is actually the grittier choice. Duckworth acknowledges that there are times when we need to rethink our goals, maybe adjust our path, or even completely abandon something that's not serving us anymore.
So grit isn't about blind persistence. It's about making wise choices, knowing when to hold on and when to let go.
And that wisdom comes from experience, from reflecting, and from being honest with ourselves about what truly matters.
I see. Duckworth also mentions the idea that encouraging grit might set unrealistic expectations, especially for young people. Could you expand on that a little?
Sure. Some people are concerned that if we emphasize grit too much, it could lead to feelings of inadequacy or discouragement, especially for those who don't naturally excel in certain areas. It's like if we're constantly hearing about these amazing people achieving incredible things through grit, we might start to feel like we're not good enough if we struggle or have setbacks.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
How does Duckworth address that?
She emphasizes that grit isn't about being perfect. It's about embracing the process of learning and growing. It's not about comparing ourselves to others. It's about focusing on our own individual journey.
So it's about celebrating effort and perseverance no matter the outcome.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, to struggle, and to ask for help. Because at the end of the day, it's through those experiences that we build resilience and develop our grit.
That makes sense. In a world that often values instant gratification and effortless success, cultivating a culture of grit, especially for younger generations, becomes even more crucial.
It really does. It's about giving them the tools they need to navigate the challenges they'll face and reach their full potential, whatever that might be.
So after this deep dive into grit, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
Well, Duckworth's book gives us a really powerful framework for understanding how grit helps us achieve our goals. It challenges us to think about our own beliefs about talent, effort, and success.
And ultimately, it encourages us to take action, to cultivate our own grit, both internally and by changing our environment.
By exploring our interests, making deliberate practice a habit, finding a purpose that gives our work meaning, and learning to hold on to hope, we can tap into the power of grit and accomplish amazing things.
And by creating a culture of grit in our homes, schools, and workplaces, we can inspire the people around us to do the same.
Duckworth leaves us with a really powerful message. Grit isn't something you're just born with. It's a skill that can be learned and developed.
And by embracing the journey of grit, we can unlock our full potential and live more fulfilling lives.
It's not about being a genius. It's about having the passion and perseverance to chase our dreams even when things get tough. Because in the words of Angela Duckworth, grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint.
So everyone listening, lace up your shoes and get ready for the long game. Because grit is the key to unlocking your extraordinary potential. Yeah, I love that analogy. Life is a marathon, not a sprint. It reminds us that building grit is a journey, not a destination. Thinking about all this, I keep coming back to Duckworth's own story. It must have been tough to have her dad always telling her she wasn't a genius.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine hearing that your whole life. But instead of letting it hold her back, she used it as motivation. She embraced grit, and look what she accomplished.
It just shows that we can all go further than we think we can, even further than people expect of us. But it's one thing to talk about how important grit is. It's another to actually develop it. Does Duckworth give us any practical advice on how to actually become grittier?
She does. She talks about developing a growth mindset. That belief that our abilities aren't fixed and can be developed through effort. She also highlights the importance of surrounding ourselves with other gritty people. Their determination can be contagious.
So the people we hang out with can actually affect how gritty we are.
Totally. Our social environment makes a huge difference. Duckworth also emphasizes finding a purpose that gives our work meaning. When we're passionate about what we're doing and believe it's important, we're way more likely to stick with it through the tough times.
It sounds like building grit is a whole person kind of thing. It involves our mindset, our surroundings, and our sense of purpose. But even with all that, we're still going to have moments of doubt. We're going to feel discouraged. How do we deal with those things that can, like, zap our grit?
Duckworth says self-awareness is really important. It's about understanding our own strengths and weaknesses, and the things that make us want to quit when things get hard.
So, like, if I know I tend to give up when I hit a certain kind of obstacle,
Yeah,
I can come up with ways to deal with that specific challenge.
right. Duckworth suggests trying to look at things from a different perspective, focusing on the bigger picture, or even taking a break and coming back with fresh eyes. Grit isn't about just pushing through no matter what. It's about being strategic.
That makes sense. It's about knowing ourselves and what we tend to do, and then using that knowledge to get through those tough spots that everyone goes through. But it also sounds like we need to be kind to ourselves along the way. We're not going to be perfectly gritty all the time.
Yeah, Duckworth emphasizes self-compassion. We got to remember that setbacks are a part of life. It happens to everyone. It's okay to make mistakes, to feel discouraged, to need a break. It's all part of learning and growing.
So true. Grit isn't about being superhuman. It's about embracing the whole journey, the ups and downs, the wins and losses.
Exactly. It's about having the courage to keep going when it's hard, because we believe in what we're doing and in our ability to reach our goals. It's about resilience, determination, and that deep down belief that we can achieve what we set our minds to.
This deep dive into grit has been awesome. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this book. It's so thought-provoking and inspiring.
It really is a book that sticks with you. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's that grit isn't just about achieving success in the outside world. It's about living a life full of purpose and meaning.
It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, because we believe in what we're doing and we believe we can make a difference. It's about embracing the marathon of life with passion and perseverance, knowing that the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
So we'll leave you with this question. What are you willing to be gritty for?
What goals, what dreams, what aspirations are worth the effort, the struggle, the inevitable setbacks?
Because as Angela Duckworth reminds us, it's in those moments of challenge that true grit really shines.
And it's in those moments that we have the biggest chance to discover just how much we can do.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into grit.
And don't forget to subscribe to Audiobook Alchemy for more insightful book summaries and powerful ideas. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep being gritty.